If you were the number one U.S. player in the points rankings since 1983, you've only won 45% of your matches. If you're number two, you've won 37% of your matches. Where if you go to Europe, if you're number one, your winning rate is 61%. If you're number two, your winning rate is 56%. So basically the top dogs in Europe have been much, much better. And you can see that anecdotally reflected, right? Phil Mickelson hasn't had the greatest record. Tiger Woods didn't have a very good record. And I just thought, I think that's significant. I think it just shows that Europe are giant killers.
Shane Ryan, author of The Cup They Couldn't Lose. Don't know if there's anyone who, in doing that book and doing your research this year for the upcoming Ryder Cup in Rome, don't know if there's anyone who knows more about the Ryder Cup. So we really appreciate you taking the time to come on the Golfers Journal podcast, and excited to dig in here on what we can expect at Marco Simone. Last Ryder Cup, we previewed the Ryder Cup with a discussion with Michael Wolff, and that one was entitled "Why I Hate the Ryder Cup." So this year, maybe going in a little different direction, I would put you in the camp very much of a Ryder Cup lover. So tell me what you love about the Ryder Cup.
That's right. I don't hate the Ryder Cup.
Sorry, you don't. It would be weird to write a book about it if you hated it.
It would. It's I worked through my demons of things I hate by writing entire books about them. That would be quite an approach. Yeah, no, I think the Ryder Cup, just to give you a quick background on me, I wasn't a golfer growing up. I didn't play golf. My stepdad was really into golf, but when I went out, I found it boring, and it wasn't really my thing until, now I'm a golf junkie, but it took a long time. But even then, when I would get so angry when the PGA Tour was on Sundays and, instead of NFL football, even then the Ryder Cup was something that just had a certain romance to me. And, it may have been as simple as the whatever bagpipe music they were using as the bumper music on NBC, but the team element was just always so cool to me. And then, I started my journalism career in the sports world covering basketball and baseball and things like that. And I worked for Grantland in 2012, and I said, you guys should send me to Chicago for the Ryder Cup in Medina. And they were like, okay, nobody else wants to do it, right? This was all the cool kids in LA. Nobody cared about golf. And so they sent me to Medina. And that was my first Ryder Cup in person. And in fact, the first golf tournament I ever covered in person. And it was just, despite the fact that the U.S. lost and Europe had that big comeback on Sunday, it was just this magical thing where everything that was so vivid to me in my imagination about the Ryder Cup was now kind of in living technicolor. And Ian Poulter was so heroic on that Saturday and Sunday. And of course the European fans were going crazy. And I think that just didn't spark, but solidified the love affair I had with the Ryder Cup. And even then I was like, man, it would be cool to write a book about this one day. And so that was how the obsession was kindled. And I think to answer your question, just the romance of it and the competition and the strategy, there's almost nothing I don't love about it.
That's awesome. That's quite a way to start as an intro to your first big event, the Ryder Cup, and it gets into and no wonder it has gotten into your bones. It's a great book, The Cup They Couldn't Lose, and I want to talk about it in depth a little more later in the podcast. But in that book, you do go into the history of the Ryder Cup. So I just wanted to give listeners a little bit of background, how the Ryder Cup has gone from being this sort of international friendly exhibition when it starts to now this media golf juggernaut that it is.
Yeah, so the Ryder Cup started in 1927 at the behest of a seed merchant named Samuel Ryder, who was a classic case of a guy who never played golf, and then he went to the doctor one day and they said, your heart's not so good, you need to do something physical, you need to get out there and get the fresh air more. And so he took up golf, and like a lot of us, became an instant obsessive, right? It became the most important thing in his life. And so he was a rich man, and like a lot of people like that, it's like once you get in, you want to go whole hog. And so he bought a trophy, and he had this idea that we'll do an exhibition, we'll bring the great American players over. And that's how it started in 1927. And, that was a point in golf history where, as what had been like a British sport had by that time already turned after World War I into something that the Americans were dominating. And that would continue for, up to the present day, arguably, but it would become more acute over the next 50 to 60 years. And so what you have is, that's kind of mirrored in the history of the Ryder Cup, where until 1983, the U.S. dominated this event to an incredible degree. I think they lost twice in 18 tries, or it's something to that effect. It was like Harlem Globetrotters against the Washington Generals. And so, World War II happens. One really cool piece of Ryder Cup history is that after World War II, it seems like almost nobody thought to start this thing up again, right? Like Europe was, England, especially in the UK, were dead poor. They'd been bombed to bits, and they were just about rebuilding their economy. And then you have this guy in Portland who, unfortunately, I'm going to forget his name. It's Robert something. But just like Samuel Ryder, he was this guy who didn't know anything about golf, was told by his doctor, you got to do something healthy, takes up golf. He's a rich businessman. He owned like the Piggly Wiggly franchise in Portland, becomes an obsessive, and decides on his own that, not only I think he brought the US Open to Portland Country Club, but he decides like we need to revive this Ryder Cup. And the British told him, sorry, we can't afford it. And so he said, that's okay. I'll pay for your passage across the ocean on this, on this very, like the Queen Mary ship or whatever, some big famous, ship. Then I'll pay for you. We'll have a big party for you in New York. Then I'll pay for your train travel across the country to Portland, Oregon to come play this Ryder Cup. And so they're okay. If you want to foot the bill completely, you're happy to do it. The U.S. won like 11-1 or something. They were so good that they sat Ben Hogan on the last day. But what this guy did in such a cool way was revive the Ryder Cup when nobody else was going to do it. Really a perfect chance for it to be forgotten by history. So it goes on. The U.S. keeps dominating. And then, to cut a long story short, in 1983, when the Ryder Cup is once again desperate, they've lost their, biggest sponsor because Europe just can't win. Tony Jacklin comes in, brings in Seve Ballesteros as a player. Jacklin was the captain, and turns it into what we know today, which is this unbelievably competitive event. That, in as short as I can make it, that is the history of the Ryder Cup, from lopsided event that never should have survived, kind of a miracle that it still existed, to, of course, this huge exhibition that is, so full of passion and everything like that.
Big shout out to Piggly Wiggly there. As you're watching the Ryder Cup this weekend, don't forget the Piggly Wiggly and the debt of gratitude that we owe it if you're enjoying your Ryder Cup viewing. I do want to dig in a little bit on that 1983, because that seems to be the turning point. I mean, so the Ryder Cup starts out, if I'm correct, it's the United States versus Great Britain. Then they add Ireland to try and make it more competitive. That doesn't quite get there. Then then it's all of Europe at some point. But 1983 becomes that moment. Europe doesn't win, but Tony Jacklin, you write about it in your book, and it's it's one of the more interesting parts of the book, how you're making the argument that he out captains Jack Nicklaus on his home turf.
Yeah, and this was, like you said, I mean, there's no reason to expect that this would be competitive. America to that point had never lost a Ryder Cup at home. This one was at the PGA National in Florida, but Jacklin had played on the Ryder Cup for years and years, and he had lost. I think they tied, of course, in the famous year of the concession, and he lost the other 6 he played in. So he had a very acute sense of what he hated about it and what he didn't like, and that was that, Europe always felt like, or in this case, the UK always felt like second-class citizens. They had worse clothing. They couldn't bring their caddies when they went to America. They didn't have a team room. Sometimes they were just in some musty old locker room. All this kind of stuff, and he wanted to change all of that. And at the same time, you had people like Bernard Langer coming up, Seve Ballesteros, right? Nick Faldo was just starting to become a prominent player. So there's this whole generation of European guys who were talented. And yeah, so he put it all together. They came to America. They shocked the Americans by making it a close Ryder Cup. And there were some funny things happening that, today almost seem quaint, but when they did their singles lineups, the idea was always that you would backload. Both teams would put their best players at the end of the lineup. It was sort of this ceremonial ritual that you always did. And Tony Jacklin said, well, we've got to do something different. We got to do anything we can to try to beat the Americans. And so, of course, he puts, Langer, Seve Ballesteros. He puts his best players 1, 2, 3. And gives that lineup to Jack Nicklaus, and Nicklaus is like stunned, right? Like you picture like a Victorian woman like fainting backward onto a couch, and he even says something like, "You can't do that, you can't do that," or something. And Jacklin's like, "Well, I did it," and it almost worked. It almost worked, and the Europeans lost by a point that day, with about 1,000 people on the entire course to watch it. TV coverage only in the in the late afternoons. They missed all the morning matches, and I think had a window of 2 hours where ABC covered it, to give you an idea of how different things were then. But then in the locker room after, the Europeans were distraught that they had lost, and Seve Ballesteros gives this like, we didn't lose. Nobody cry. We cry when we win. And he's marching back and forth, basically pumping everybody up and telling them, 1985, we're going to win. We're going to win back in the Belfry. And they did. Yeah. And so that was, Tony Jacklin kind of changed things. He was more organized, and he started the very early version of this template that Europe has carried on for the decades since, which they're so, devoted to. Of course, changed things and made Europe this huge Ryder Cup power.
I mean, you mentioned, I saw you write somewhere that this was, at one point, the Ryder Cup was even a tournament where like players would skip it, would find ways to back out. Who ever did that?
So yeah, it was in 1977, which was the last year before it was Team Europe, right? So this was the last year of Great Britain and Ireland.
Yeah.
It wasn't Tom Kite, it wasn't Tom Lehman, Tom Weiskopf, I think, was the guy who did it. He skipped to go hunting for sheep.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and so he was just like, well, I don't know when I'm going to get a chance to hunt sheep again, the bighorn sheep, right? And so he skipped the Ryder Cup, and then Nicklaus that year played a match that he actually won, but it was cold out, and the players he was playing, he was really mad because they were playing very slow and he was freezing. So he actually wrote a letter to this guy, Lord Derby, who was the head of the British PGA, Queen's cousin, like a real high muckety muck, and he basically told him, between Weiskopf skipping it and between all this other stuff, this event is about to die unless you do something. And what I think you should do is invite Team Europe in, because it's just not competitive. So yeah, Jack Nicklaus deserves a huge tip of the cap for kind of not just having the vision that things needed to change, but basically going to the highest guy and saying, do it now, because this Weiskopf thing is sort of just the tip of the iceberg if things don't get better in a hurry.
And then in 1985, for your Team Europe, they do get much better at the Belfry. Lee Trevino versus Tony Jacklin is captains. Jacklin captaining again. You write about that in your book as well. Trevino it was an interesting week for Trevino.
Yeah, Trevino. Now, I'm going off a lot of memory here. I think he was just going through a divorce. And it's easy to blame some of those early American captains. And I think I wrote this in the book. The reality is that America had just been winning for so long that there was no sense of, even after, what happened in 83, there wasn't a real acute sense of what was happening on the other side. Like, that you had this rising tide, this wave that was about to crash over you and change the Ryder Cup completely. What you had basically was just ceremonial captains who had the arrogance of the victor, right? Not any kind of offensive arrogance, but the arrogance of just, well, this is how it's happened. This is how it's worked for 60 years. We go over there and we win, and all the European fans get to see the big American players, and it's a big treat for them, and this is how it goes. And so what he didn't know and what he wasn't prepared for was this undercurrent that was happening with Jacklin and Ballesteros that was about to rise to such levels that, the Europeans were, not just the team was ready to compete, but the fans were ready to kind of treat it like a soccer match, right? They were about ready to get in the Americans' faces. And again, we talked about the Nicklaus being so surprised at the order in 1983. The U.S. players this time were shocked at the treatment they got from the European fans. The intensity of it, the sense of, hey, now we feel like our team can win, so we're going to treat it like a team that can win, and we're going to support them. And just the overall intensity of it just took them totally by surprise. Again, Jacklin was much more strategically, had everything together compared to Trevino, who was completely winging it. And Europe wins this event. They win it pretty convincingly. I think it was 16.5 to 11.5 or something like that. And that was probably the first real wake-up call for the U.S. Sure, they knew in 83 they had gotten beat, but this was, not only did we get beat, but we kind of got thrashed, and they stuck it to us in a bunch of different ways. So Trevino wasn't ready, basically, for what hit him.
So, so you talk about now the fans are getting into it. They're recognizing we have a chance, and then you take it to, I always think of, the war by the shore as, that's the first Ryder Cup I can really remember. And not even knowing what the Ryder Cup was, but my dad calling, hey, you've got to watch this, look what's going on. And that maybe being the sort of rise of the Ryder Cup as we know it now with an event of great patriotism, national pride, animosity, all that stuff. It seems like it's born there in Kiowa.
Yeah, yeah, and the great irony was, the U.S. had another Ryder Cup in between that after '85. In '87, they played at Jack Nicklaus's home course up at Muirfield Village, and Nicklaus was the captain again. And the American players knew what the fans were like in Europe, but the American fans hadn't caught on yet because this wasn't on TV. They didn't know what the Ryder Cup was, and so they're going there basically going, "Oh, a fun exhibition." And there's all these great stories of Jack Nicklaus, buying American flags, little American flags by the thousands to hand out, doing anything he can to try to get these fans to behave like they would in Europe, and the fans just not getting it. The fans going like, yeah, we'll wave these flags around, but none of the passion, right? None of the kind of ardor that the Europeans had. And that's the year that the Europeans finally won on American soil for the first time. And, Nicklaus had quotes from '83 when he won where he said, the last thing I want is to be, the first American captain to lose it at home. And here he was watching the nightmare unfold, right? And the American fans just were not into it. And so, like you said, it took until '91. Dave Stockton was the captain for the Americans, happened to coincide with Desert Storm. So there was this kind of aura of patriotism going around the country. And Stockton took it on himself to basically tour America, drumming up support and trying to teach people what the Ryder Cup was. By that time, maybe a few more people had seen it on TV. And again, you had that patriotic fervor and you had an incredibly close Ryder Cup. And to your point, your dad having called you and saying you have to watch this. It was that year NBC had got the rights for the Ryder Cup, and John Miller, who I talked to, who's a big executive there, he was the guy kind of in charge of it, and he had made the call to get it. And his higher ups were seeing the ratings and the fact that on Saturday it preempted the local news, which always costs the money. And they were kind of saying to him, what have you done? Like, this is a disaster having this Ryder Cup. And then Sunday came along and you had this incredible finish with, Langer and Irwin on the last hole. And the executive called John Miller, the one who had just been yelling at him, and basically said, "This is the greatest thing I've ever seen. How do we make sure we have this for the next, decades?" And so, yeah, that was, you're exactly right. The American fans got into it. That was the birth of the intense Ryder Cup in America. It had already been born in Europe, but that was when it became in America kind of what we recognize today.
So when Europe wins for the first time on American soil at Muirfield, who was the European? Was it Jacqueline again?
Still Jacqueline, who was also there in '89. So Jacqueline did 4 Ryder Cups and didn't want to.
Yeah.
It was kind of like, I want to be done. And they're like, no, we need you. We need you.
Maybe that's the one. So when you write about how he kind of outmaneuvers Nicklaus on his own course, how did that take?
And that year the Americans were sort of ready, right? The Americans didn't have any illusions anymore about an easy Ryder Cup. They knew it was going to be tough. And, it was just in this case, one of those weird Ryder Cups where the pair sessions were all Europe. And this was the start of a trend that, of course, we would see throughout the '90s and the 2000s and everything like that, where, the first session was tied 2-2. Then you come out in afternoon 4-ball and the Europeans just run over them. They win all 4 matches. It becomes more even after that on Saturday. The Europeans still have a slight edge, but they're up 10.5 to 5.5 going into Sunday singles and almost blow it, to be fair. Like, the U.S. almost came back and got them on Sunday singles. Europe ended up winning 15 to 13. And it just so happened that, the Europeans played better on the 18th hole in a crazy amount of matches. I think something like 6 matches went to 18 and Europe ended up winning 5 of them. So they won every close match, but the U.S. almost came back. There's this famous moment after where, before the victory ceremony, Nicklaus took all his players into his house to basically yell at them after they had lost, being like, "You guys don't have enough heart. You didn't have enough you weren't clutch enough." And all the players being like, "Well, what do you want us to do? It's over." So, yeah, so I don't know if the story of that one is so much outmaneuvering by Jacqueline as it is that Europe just, he had great partnerships. And I think maybe there were some things like, Lanny Watkins and Larry Nelson had been successful, but they didn't really play with each other as much. And just everything kind of went wrong for them over the first 2 days.
Okay. So moving forward into the current Ryder Cup era, something that folks will hear about as they're listening, they will hear about the recent history. And I just wanted to ask you about the current history of the pod system, and the task force and all that stuff. Explain the task force and the pod system to people. And do you know if they're doing the pods this year?
So yeah, pods are something that have, it was an innovation by Paul Azinger in 2008 at Valhalla, based on him watching this documentary by accident about the Navy SEALs and learning that, okay, the Navy SEALs, when they train, they put them in these groups of 6 or something like that, in these small groups, and fosters loyalty, and obviously working together makes them better soldiers and all that kind of stuff. And so he had the thought, he was about to be captain, and he had played a ton of Ryder Cups. And one thing that he always struggled with was this idea of, here we have an individual sport, right, where you're competing against all these Americans all the time. And then in the Ryder Cup, you're supposed to come together and it's going to be kumbaya and you're going to be this team. And he always kind of thought that was bogus. And, Europe always seemed to be better at it than the Americans. And so based on that Navy SEALs doc, he had this idea, well, what if we reduce the numbers, right? Like what if the secret to cohesion is actually having fewer people hang out with each other? What if instead of 12 friends, you only have to have 3 friends? And so he divided his guys based on, psychological, like, we're going to have the rednecks over here and the hotshots over here. So he divided them into groups of 4 that would practice together, that would get to know each other, and they would play together as partners. And so that worked really well for him in 2008. And he also happened to have a rare, terrible European captain in Nick Faldo as his opposite number. And so the Americans just, ran all over them in Kentucky. In true American style, they forgot all about it the next time. Davis Love brought it back for 2012, but then again in 2014 at Glen Eagles, you had this disaster where Tom Watson was everything that was kind of wrong about American captains, going with his gut, not really knowing his players, not really taking any strategy steps, just thinking they would go in there and, he walked into a monster in Paul McGinley, who is one of the greatest captains ever, who beat them. And yeah, to answer your question, from there, the task force was born. The U.S. basically after Glen Eagles, it's such a disaster. And Phil Mickelson has his little rebellion in the press conference where he calls out Tom Watson. It's at that point that even if you're the most diehard American who's like, it's just about how you play, all this strategy stuff is overrated, the captains are overrated, you can't really say that anymore after 2014. It was so bad that, Davis Love and Mickelson and, Jim Furyk, all these guys start this task force and try to turn things around. And so that's the era we are in now, where the U.S. has really, gotten its act together and had a great Ryder Cup at Hazeltine, got really unlucky in Paris, and, playing on the road is very hard. Had an amazing Ryder Cup at Whistling Straits. And here we are in Italy, where to kind of prove the point that the task force worked and that America is on the rise, you got to do what you haven't done in 30 years, which is actually win in Europe. And, these are the stakes of the current Ryder Cup, which I think, makes it pretty fun. Makes it maybe one of the most exciting Ryder Cups in the last decade or so.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely want to get to, what's at stake, especially for Europe. It's really interesting. I'm glad you brought up Paul McGinley. We can, listeners to the Golfers Journal podcast can go back a few episodes, well, several episodes, and hear Paul McGinley talk about leadership and his leadership of that team. It is absolutely illuminating. Yeah, I can see why you'd call him one of the best captains of all time. What made Faldo such a bad captain?
Arrogance. In a word, arrogance.
No, I don't think that.
Practical. Yeah, right. It's funny, Nick Faldo, his image has very much changed now, where he's, I know people, to call him a beloved announcer would be vastly overstating it, but there is something kind of warm and fuzzy about his retirement and things like that. But at the time, yeah, I mean, he was never like the most well-liked player by his fellow Europeans. I mean, there's a famous story that he was left off the team in '99 by Mark Brooks at the Brookline Ryder Cup, and he wrote this letter saying good luck to the team, and Mark Brooks ripped it up in front of the other players. And there's just like stories like that where he just, great Ryder Cup player and obviously an amazing golfer, but not the most beloved person. So anyway, 2008 comes, and just a similar story to Tom Watson, where not much preparation. One of my favorite very small stories in Ryder Cup history is that Paul McGinley, which a lot of people don't know, was an assistant captain, a vice captain for Nick Faldo at the start, and lasted a couple months before he just quit. So he just, yeah. And if you ask McGinley now, he'll be very, very diplomatic about it and say, well, we just got the sense that Nick Faldo was his own man and stuff like that. But this is just me talking, but you get the sense that McGinley, being such a smart Ryder Cup mind, that maybe there was a sense of, if I want to be a Ryder Cup captain later, I don't want the stink of what's about to happen on me. So like it was coming a million miles away that Faldo wasn't strategic. He wasn't making any effort to follow the template that had been so successful. You have to remember, coming into 2008, it had been the high tide of European Ryder Cups. They had just won back-to-back Ryder Cups by 18.5 to 9.5. They were just destroying the Americans, and he wasn't following the path, and he was doing his own thing. And it just seemed like, like I said, at the same time, you had Azinger, a captain that was forward-thinking for the first time for the U.S., and it was just this confluence of events that was going to go really badly, and it did.
And it did. So moving up to the Ryder Cup this year in Rome, and the captains, we've got Luke Donald v. Zach Johnson. Do you know if Donald is employing if Zach Johnson is employing this pod system, and who's in them?
Yeah, and so it's the pod system as it exists now is not as neatly defined as Azinger made it. It's just basically like, we know what our partnerships are going to be. And it's really no secret with the Americans this year for the most part, right? Like Thomas and Spieth will play together. Cantley and Xander will play together. There's certain interesting twists where it's like, well, Scheffler and Burns are great friends. Are they going to play together? Because they did play together at the President's Cup and were bad, right? And they lost almost all of their matches. And so there are some questions remaining. When you learn about the pod system is when the practice rounds happen, and so you can tell just by who plays together who's going to end up pairing, in the actual Ryder Cup. Colin Morikawa would be an interesting one, where he was so successful with Dustin Johnson last time. Who's he going to play with? Is it Max Homa? Maybe a lot of people are thinking. So I don't know. I don't have a direct answer for you about who's in the pods, but in terms of, are they employing the pod system? Yes, but they're not afraid to. I don't want to say they adjust, but stats plays an enormous role in the Ryder Cup now. So last year, for instance, I'm remembering there was a pairing that really surprised me. Yeah, so on day one in the afternoon, it was Justin Thomas and Patrick Cantley playing, which wasn't something anyone expected, but was obviously something that the stats said, these guys are really good, send them out together. And then you had, in the afternoon, you had just some. The rest of it was mostly predictable. You had Tony Finau and Harris English playing, but then you had Brooks Koepka and Jordan Spieth playing on Saturday afternoon. So there are deviations from it, but essentially, yes, they do work in a pod system where the pairings going in.
So definitely worth checking out the practice rounds, see what's going on. There was some interest and some intrigue around the captaincies specifically for Europe. Henrik Stenson replaced by Luke Donald when Stenson goes to Live Golf. And then interestingly, there's a Live golfer in the field with Brooks Koepka. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think Stenson got a bad deal? Is Europe better off?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my understanding, they got assurances from Henrik Stenson when they made him the captain, because I remember when it was happening, it was around the Honda Classic in 2022, which, by the way, is the worst event I've ever covered. It was dire. It was dire, but that's neither here nor there. But yeah, this was happening, and it's probably either going to be Luke Donald or Stenson. Stenson would be the shoe-in, except they were worried that there were all these rumors that he might be a Live golfer. And from my understanding of it, they got a bunch of assurances from him that he wouldn't, made him the captain, and then, he did. So did he get a raw deal? No. I mean, I think there was an understanding there. I think there was an understanding that was broken. And so, yeah, then Luke Donald, he was the one that took over for sure.
The role of the vice captains, I think, is interesting, particularly this year, because Edoardo Molinari is someone who you've heard about this last year, really helping a lot of players in terms of his statistical analysis and sort of being a consultant for some of the hottest players. What kind of role do the vice captains play, and where do you see the advantage this year?
Yeah, and it's funny because Europe got rid of their stats group. They were with this group called the 21st group that had been with them since Hazeltine, and made a big difference in Paris according to everyone. And they got rid of them because Edoardo Molinari apparently is good enough to do it on his own with his team, of course. The vice captains have various roles. It's emerged in the modern Ryder Cup that the captain doesn't actually get to be on the course a ton, because, he has got to organize everything. Obviously in the morning sessions on Friday and Saturday, you've got to be, looking to who you're going to put out in the afternoon, and they have to sort of take the overview of it. So it's almost a waste of time for them to follow one match or something. So, one system that we've seen a lot lately is that there is a vice captain for each of the pairs matches, somebody with them to help them get whatever they need, but also to report back to the captain directly. Like, Xander Schauffele's terrible right now. He can't hit a driver, whatever the case is, to kind of feed intelligence back. Of course, they also have an army of statistical people to do that as well. So yeah, that's Paul McGinley, I think, was the one who started that with more vice captains, one for each match type deal, and that's sort of their role. I mean, but there's all kinds of different things. You could look at Fred Couples for the U.S., who's just kind of a vibes guy, right? Everybody likes him. Everybody likes having him around, so he's there just to sort of, just because he's fun to have around. And then, other people, you have former captains who can consult and everything like that. Obviously, Stricker, Furyk, Davis Love. With the U.S. especially, you're starting to see it almost like a board, an executive board that just keeps returning, right? Davis Love captained the President's Cup. Furyk's captaining the next President's Cup. It's like they're recycling guys for the first time like that. So yeah, that's essentially their role. I don't think there's an edge this year. I think both systems are so firmly in place and so finely tuned. And I think both captains are really good, and they're both system guys that I don't think there's going to be a ton of difference between the captains, right? I don't think, I thought Patrick Harrington made some weird missteps last time. I don't think you're going to have that this time. I think you're going to have two guys who are by the book and kind of smart about it.
Okay. And speaking of statistics, you recently did a very deep dive on Ryder Cup statistics and a lot of interesting stuff in there. Of the stats that you found, what were the most surprising and the most significant?
Yeah, I'm looking at them here. I think the one that surprised me the most was that this is all since 1983, by the way. I kind of made the choice that it's sort of useless to analyze stats before then because the Cup was such a blowout. So we started, okay, when did it get competitive? But yeah, I thought it was interesting that, the U.S. rookies have a record above 500 over the stretch, and European rookies are 78, 101, and 37 as a record. So for whatever reason, European rookies have not been as good. The other really interesting thing that I found was that I looked at the final standings rank before the Ryder Cup, so your points list basically, and tried to get the records from each position. And what I found was that if you were the number one U.S. player in the points rankings since 1983, you've only won 45% of your matches. If you're number two, you've won 37% of your matches. Where if you go to Europe, if you're number one, your winning rate is 61%. If you're number two, your winning rate is 56%. So basically the top dogs in Europe have been much, much better. And you can see that anecdotally reflected, right? Phil Mickelson hasn't had the greatest record. Tiger Woods didn't have a very good record. And I just thought, that I think that's significant. I think it just shows that Europe are giant killers and that they take a ton of pride in taking down guys like Tiger Woods. They love to, collect that kind of win on their side. So just little things like that, captain's picks I looked at, all time, they're all about 500, which I thought was really interesting, for both sides. Europe is a little bit over, the U.S. is a little bit under, but we make so much of that, and it turns out, going down, they're not any better than average, basically. Mm-hmm. And then I broke it down by format. This is all in Golf Digest, but I broke it down by format. It seems that if you're the home team, alternate shot is your best, your best format. For whatever reason, home teams have dominated alternate shot over the years. So just little kind of nuggets like that. If you're a real Ryder Cup nerd, you can kind of dig in and see that kind of stuff.
I wonder if the statistics bear this out. One of the things that I really love about the Ryder Cup is that even though these players, a lot of the Euros, will live in America, et cetera, I think it does expose some sort of cultural differences in the formats and how they perform. And maybe I'm dealing just strictly in cultural stereotypes, and that's fine. But that the Euros in the team matches where they're playing foursomes or four ball, where it's more technical, where it's more about the sort of communal effort, which are adjectives I would describe more as being more European in nature. And then when you get to the singles, that sort of individualism, that rugged individualism, you see the Americans thriving more in that environment. Certainly just did in the Walker Cup. Did the statistics bear those sort of cultural differences out?
Yeah, so I'll give you the singles record since 1983 for the U.S. is 116-11. I'm cleaning up the percentages a little bit, but they're five matches over 500. In foursomes, they're 8 matches under 500, and in four ball, they are looking here. 15 matches under 500. So yeah, the stats do bear it out. And what's funny about it is that they should be, based on their talent, they should be even better in singles too. But even there, you see the discrepancy where they're a little bit over 500 in singles and getting walloped in the pairs formats. So yeah, I mean, I'm with you. It's unprovable, I think, and it is based on what we see. But it is true. I mean, there are players on Europe that aren't well liked, right? We talk about Nick Faldo. Colin Montgomery wasn't everybody's best friend, but they seem to be much better at coming together, even with guys that aren't their best friends, and just having this sort of cohesion as a group. And, a million anecdotes about that, but like you said, the stats kind of bear it out. Yeah. You put them with a teammate, and they kick butt.
Yeah, it's like sort of postcard sociology, but I think it's interesting for sure. Yeah. So you're going to Rome. I assume you're going to Rome.
I am going to Rome. Yeah, I'm pumped. Can't wait.
What are you most excited? What are you most pumped about seeing when you get there? Are you looking? Is it the course? Is it the fans? Is it a particular player? What are you most looking forward to when you get to the Ryder Cup?
I was joking with my friend Jamie Kennedy, who's at Digest. He's a European, and I said, I don't know why, but the inclusion of Ludwig Aberg on the European team made me somehow 10% more excited for this Ryder Cup. And I was already very excited. It's no secret. You can tell I'm pumped. But yeah, having him on the team, I just think is so intriguing and such a out of the box pick by Luke Donald. So little things like that. I'm excited to see how he plays. But yeah, I mean, everything about it. I'm excited just to see Italy. I've never been there before. And my wife and I are taking a little trip afterward to enjoy. Yeah, I will definitely be manging. I just think it's every little thing. There's just everything is exciting about the Ryder Cup, and half of it you can't predict. There's going to be some stupid controversy on Tuesday that's going to be hilarious, right? You just don't know what it's going to be quite yet, but there's always something, and if there's not something, the English press will find something to drum up into a story.
Indeed, there you go. What about tell us about the golf course. It's a very new venue. So new. I remember there were rumors not that long ago. They're not going to get it finished in time, and they're going to have to go to Adair Manor and all that. So it's finished and ready to go. What do you know about the golf course? So
the European Tour is not as rich as the PGA Tour, and so part of their system with Ryder Cup courses is that, there's a deal where to host the Ryder Cup, you have to, put a lot of money in, you have to agree to host 1 million European Tour events for so many years. So what happens, and we've seen it the last few times, is that typically these resort courses are the ones that step up because they want to have a Ryder Cup, they want the prestige, and they attract tourists that way, and they attract people. So that was sort of the case with Glen Eagles, definitely the case with the Golf National in Paris, and it's also the case with Marco Simoni in Italy. And that's a nice way of,
for sure, yeah.
Yeah, right. And so that's a nice way of saying that these aren't the best, nicest, most famous courses in Europe or anything like that. But so they're just resort courses. They're normal, but they're allowed. What you can do if you're Europe, having control of the course, is you can tailor these courses sort of however you want them. And for them, that means, we're going to narrow the fairways. We're going to build out the rough to these crazy degrees. There's all these stories of, these trips that the US and Europe just took there, losing balls, just flat out losing. Like we have, it's 5 feet in the rough and we have absolutely no idea where that ball is and we're never getting it back. So yeah, it's just that's kind of the course. I don't think it's anything special, really. I think it's, and that's okay for me. I think the Ryder Cup is so interesting that to me, all you need is a few drivable par fours. You need some risk reward holes, and it doesn't have to be at St. Andrews, right? I mean, it would be great if it was. Don't get me wrong, but it'll be fine. It'll just be a fine Ryder Cup course.
In a cup they couldn't lose. You write. It's again a wonderful book about not just the last Ryder Cup at Whistling Straits. But also, the history of the Ryder Cup and everything we've been talking about here. So do check it out. That was a cup America couldn't lose. Is obviously your thesis because it's the title. Why was it a cup they couldn't lose?
because after Glen Eagles, you had this task force which organizes everything, right? And it's supposedly America's finally going to look at decades of Ryder Cup futility, figure out what Europe did right, figure out what they did right the few times it worked, like Azinger. They're going to, take the players into account. They're going to make this a comprehensive, good experience where all the strategy is right, where the players have everything they need, where there's no reason that the talent advantage that America has almost always had can't rise to the forefront. So they do that, right? After 2014, they go into Hazeltine and they dominate. So it works there. Then you go into Paris and everybody's riding high, but a few weird things happen in Paris, which is your captain's picks end up being kind of the worst fit for the course. They get surprised by the course a lot. There's just a big learning experience. Jim Furyk didn't do a bad job, but he just had a lot of bad luck, and Europe played well, and the U.S. didn't. And so they lose that. So going into Whistling Straits, the idea is that if you have truly changed things, and if you've studied history and you've figured things out, you can't lose at home. You just can't. You can't lose that Whistling Straits Ryder Cup when you have home field advantage, which is now so massive in the Ryder Cup, that if you lose this, it disproves everything that you think you've accomplished. And I actually think, it wasn't BS. The U.S. really had done a great job rebuilding the Ryder Cup structure. And I predicted, you can go back, I predicted they would blow them out at Whistling Straits, and they did. But yeah, that was the idea of the book. The thesis is, if you lose this, it's a disaster, and we have to throw our hands up and say, we're probably never going to win the Ryder Cup with any consistency, right? It's Europe's thing, and we have no answers, and we don't know why.
Is this a Ryder Cup that Team Europe can't lose? I mean, if you think about having Rahm, Rory, and Hovland, I mean, that's a three-headed monster there. What is the are you going to be writing book 2 but with blue letters on the cover this time?
Yeah, there's no book coming, but it is. If you continue that narrative, it's from the U.S. side, again, if you want to prove that you're truly on the ascendancy, you got to go win in Europe. And on the opposite side, it's just flipped, right? If you're Europe, you've got to prevent that from happening. Europe has won in home blowouts 2 straight times. Again, they haven't lost in 30 years at home. If you lose at home, then what I have begun to suspect is accurate, which is that the U.S. is caught up strategically, and they have better players, top to bottom. I'm not saying, the top 3 guys are that different, but top to bottom, the U.S. is better, and they have proven their point if they win in Europe, and they have reversed decades of momentum, and they're the kings. They're the kings of the hill now. So Europe is trying to stop that, and on their side, they have a good captain. They have the massive advantage of being at home and having their fans, there. And they also have the advantage of setting up the course. And so there's all that kind of stuff. If they don't win, they don't really have a good excuse, except that, America's figured it out, and we're kind of on the back foot now.
Now, when you were doing the book, you likely, I'm assuming, had access to behind-the-scenes things and interviews, etc., seeing things that typical fans don't see. Was there a moment that you recall and thinking, damn, the Ryder Cup is so cool?
You'd be shocked at how little access I had. It just doesn't work that way anymore. It's funny because John Feinstein wrote a book about the Hazeltine Ryder Cup, and he went to Davis Love and wanted to be in the locker room. And Davis Love said no, and John Feinstein was furious at that. That was like come on, me, and I can just disappear in the locker room. And it's just funny to me to hear that because, Feinstein obviously has a lot of stature. I wouldn't even begin to think about asking to be in the locker room. That would be so far outside the realm of possibility. So no, I mean, look, I got to talk to Steve Stricker a bunch of times. I got to talk to the guy. I was there every second I could be at press conferences, but by no means was I in the team room. So don't get it confused. That's part of the reason why the book took a historical angle. I wanted to do that anyway, but if I sold like this is all access, I'm going to tell you what happened in the locker room. Right. That would have been bubkiss. So I don't have like a ton of good stuff there, but I just think little things you learn about the Ryder Cup, they're little things you catch, like Patrick Cantlay was Xander Schauffele coming out the turn in one of their matches on Saturday, and just saying, having a little edge and saying something like, I'll censor my language here. I don't know what your policy is on that, but basically it's time to step on their bleeping. Oh yeah, it's like time to step on their fucking necks, like things like that you just get a little sense of the intensity of it. And I think one big revelation to me was that, the US was accused of not being able to get together throughout the 90s and 2000s. Maybe they didn't care as much as the Europeans. Well, now there's a generation there that grew up watching the US get stomped by Europe throughout their entire childhoods. And it means so much to them because of that, in a way that it probably didn't, frankly, to guys like Tiger, right? Or somebody, or even going back, someone like, a little older, like Jim Furyk or whoever, because they grew up where the Ryder Cup wasn't even really a big deal. Like Davis Love was very, open about that. He's like, when I started my career, the Ryder Cup meant almost nothing to me because it was, growing up as a kid, it wasn't that big a thing. But now that's completely different. And so the US, their passion to win it is so strong among these young players. And that makes such a huge difference.
Yeah, I think that's one of the coolest things about watching the Ryder Cup is that you get to see some different sides of players that you don't see week to week on the PGA Tour, whether it's their excitement, their disappointment, their nerves, that these are just sides of golfers that you're used to seeing them in one context and playing in sort of one mindset, and the Ryder Cup can kind of maybe shake them out a little bit, which is always just fascinating and interesting to see. Speaking of some points that I mentioned our last podcast why I hate the Ryder Cup. So speaking of some points to the contrary, I want to bring up some of the things that Michael Wolff shared with us last time we talked about the Ryder Cup and see what your reaction would be to some of his arguments. First of which would be that the players don't care about the Ryder Cup as much as we think they do, or as we do, that it's in some sense much ado about little.
First of all, I want to say I love the debate format where I get to respond and the other person is not even here to rebut me. It's great.
I think it's fair.
Yeah, I would love all debates to be that way. No, I mean, look, I just completely disagree with that. I mean, we've kind of been over on the American side, but I mean, you looked at Whistling Straits with this blowout last time. In the European press conference, I remember counting, I think 5 or 6 out of the 12 guys were crying in the press conference, and not crying because they lost, but crying because of how much the camaraderie meant to them. Shane Lowry said something like, "This is the greatest week of my professional life," and we just got, blitzed basically by the Americans. Yeah, I don't know what he's basing that off of, but I do think the players care quite a lot, and I think the Europeans, I mean, it's meant everything to them because it's so important to beat America, and I think, like I said, this American generation they really care.
And we don't want to beat up on Michael. You can go back and listen to why I hate the Ryder Cup, anyone, and get his side of things, where he makes very thoughtful and thorough arguments as to why the Ryder Cup is not really his thing. But since it is your thing, I do want to give you that. I think it's interesting to discuss some of these points because they are points not just Michael make that others you hear from others as well. One being that the Ryder Cup is sort of overhyped and becomes and by the media during a slow time in golf where there's nothing else going on, that it is made to be something bigger than it is. Or is it that big?
Yeah, I mean it's one of those funny things in life, isn't it, where you buy into things and they become big in your head. There's almost everything you could diminish. Like the Masters isn't that big. It's a golf tournament. Who cares? Right? Like there's nothing that actually matters on this march to death that we're all on, right, Tom? But no, I mean, I think in the context of golf, I think the Ryder Cup is big. I care about, I'm not drumming it up, for nothing. I would never write a book about something I didn't actually care about, because that would just seems like a miserable process. It's like if you're like, I actually don't like golf or Ireland, but I'm going to write this book about golfing in Ireland. I assume that would never happen for you. But no, yeah. So is it everything like this becomes overhyped? And sure, there are probably financial interests in overhyping it, right? Making it a big deal. Television loves it. You want the ratings. Golf media. If we had a golf media collective hive mind, which we don't, obviously things like that would be good. Yeah, let's build it up. It would be good for us. It's good for our industry. Nobody actually thinks that way, but I can see that. But no, I think it's like in terms of, the nerves it produces and the drama and the strategy and all of it. I just think people legitimately love it. I don't think it's a put on, is my perspective.
Okay. And last one, Michael does talk about the money, which you mentioned there, that now it raises however, I don't have access to those numbers, but it certainly is a profitable endeavor. The cost of tickets, the cost of a beer, we talked about on that podcast, and it being run by the PGA of America, which is an organization for club pros and of club pros.
Right.
And where is that money going? Because if the Ryder Cup is making X more dollars than it used to, the lives of PGA Tour player or PGA club pros are not necessarily improving. Do you know anything about where the money goes, or the expense, or the?
Yeah, I wrote an article last year called "The Club Pro Crisis," where I kind of dug into the quality of life. Yeah, the quality of life. Thank you. I like how I just said yeah after you said it was great. Yes, I know.
yeah, it was great. No, we had our friend Chandler's been on the podcast as well, so he was central to that. It was really thoughtful.
Yeah, but one thing I probably didn't do well enough in that article is chase down, where do these massive profits go? How is the PGA of America using it to improve the lives of club pros? And there are little cosmetic things they do, like, we have a mental health hotline now, but obviously money would make a much bigger difference. So yeah, those are all legitimate concerns that Michael Wolff brings up, and I wouldn't diminish those at all. And it's kind of funny how it's sort of part and parcel of the golf ecosystem we're dealing with at the moment, where this is stuff that people love and that you enjoy, and there's a certain romance attached to it, and money just corrupts it completely, right? And so then you have to, as whoever you are, as a fan or as a writer, or even as a player like Rory McIlroy, you have to choose how you're going to rationalize and reconcile that in your head. And there's no easy answers to that. So it's like, yes, this Ryder Cup, this thing that I love and that I love writing about and talking about, there are going to be elements of it where it's like, okay, all this massive profit, what is the European Tour doing it? What is the PGA of America doing it? Are they spending enough on the club pros? And I forget the phrase, but it's like, if you introduce money into the conversation, God walks out of the room, or there's something like that, where it's like, there's just going to be something ugly about it, and if you let it, it can diminish the what you love about the event that's not tied to money. And again, it's up to each individual how you kind of figure that out for yourself. I don't have a good answer for that. I'll concede the point to Michael Wolff in absentia here.
Well, I think when it comes to money, and talk about any big event or anything that gets huge and gets more expensive, and you can apply it to any number of tournaments or big events in golf. The thing makes more money, so the machine that makes the thing gets bigger, and that's usually where the money goes. So I don't even know what the real profit of this is, or why we have $12 beers. And sometimes it's to build out these places and to sort of have these organizations that run these things. They themselves just get more behemoth and more expensive. But that's neither here nor there. I'll call it, I would say, between the debate between the hater of the Ryder Cup and the lover of the Ryder Cup. Well, I left that podcast as still a lover of the Ryder Cup, and your enthusiasm for this, I'm so much more excited after listening to you talk about it for the Ryder Cup. I mean, I hope people watch this on YouTube, because you can actually see your excitement when you talk about this stuff and how much it matters to you. And it's made it matter more to me. So tell us, of course, we need to know who's going to win this thing.
Yeah, take that, Michael Wolff. No, I love it. I'm a big fan too. Hopefully he'll laugh at this.
He will.
Who's going to win the Ryder Cup? That's great. And it's, I reserve the right to change my opinion, but I think I want to step out on a limb here and say that the Americans are going to win. Now, it's a tough one. It's really tough to say that because, like I said, we all know what Europe's done at the home field advantage and winning for 30 years and all that stuff. I think the U.S. has become a well-oiled machine. I think they've thought of everything, and all they need to do is play well. They've given themselves the chance to win, where I don't think you could say that in Paris. You definitely could not say that in Glen Eagles. And throughout the 90s and 2000s playing in Europe, you really couldn't say that. So I want to tip my cap to them and say they have given themselves the chance to win. And so I'll go out on a limb right now and say that they are going to win. But one thing Paul McGinley said to me the other day is that what the Ryder Cup really needs is a close Ryder Cup. We've had 4 blowouts in a row for the home team, and I totally agree with him. And I think what's great about this Ryder Cup is I think it should be close. And that's, I think, going to be massive. I don't think it's going to be a blowout in either direction. So that's what I'm really rooting for, is a close Ryder Cup. And for the prediction game, I'll go ahead and say that the U.S. will win this one.
Okay. Well, yeah, I agree. A close Ryder Cup would be awesome. I would love to be watching it. It wouldn't be if it came down to like the last couple matches. I don't know when.
Yeah, like 2 matches at the end.
That would just be so. That would be such a blast. So let's hope for that. And Shane, I can't thank you enough. Everyone, check out the Cup They Couldn't Lose. Wonderful book, and really appreciate your time. Hey, by the way, at the end of your prologue, you stole one of my lines. What was the line? A course called Whistling Straits.
Yeah, I do. I will. Give me your address. I'll send you 10% of my royalties.
Yeah, no, we'll work out the royalty.
The funny thing is, and I love your books, and I did not even think of that writing it, and I haven't thought of it until just now that I'm like, I did steal. That is a Tom Coyneism.
No. It's fair play. It's three simple words that just sometimes go together. But Shane, thanks so much for the time. Enjoy Rome. Enjoy the food. Enjoy the history. Are you going So you're going to Rome? Are you going elsewhere in Italy? I highly recommend
Florence. Going to Florence. I think we'll do the photo op at Cinque Terre with the houses on the cliffs in the background.
Yep.
And then probably Siena, make a day trip to Siena or something like that. It's a big enough country that there's a lot, like we won't hit southern Italy at all or Milan or anything, but we're going to do our best. And Florence is the one everybody's like, you got to go to Florence. So
hey Shane, you got to go to Florence.
Thank you.
It's great.
Thank you.
Enjoy. And you know what? And don't think just because you're in Italy you shouldn't get pizza, because it's like so obvious. Pizza's really good. Get the pizza with the fungi. All right.
I will not
Shane.
be bullied into not getting pizza. Perfect.
Have a great time.
Thanks, Tom.